Hello everyone, and welcome to another night here at the Fireside Tales. Once more we'll be traveling into the abyss of madness, and staring into the eyes of death itself, as I tell you all another horror story. Now, let us begin. Jacob Turner awoke, and everywhere there was darkness. Darkness as far as his eyes could see. Frantically, he tried to think how he had got there. His mind tried to figure out where he was and what he had been doing last. Finally, he managed to remember it. He remembered that he had been laying in his bed, and his wife was there, and his 4 children, and the doctor. And the doctor had told him a bunch of medical stuff that he didn't really understand, but also, at the very end, the fact that he was going to die, and that if he had anything to say to his wife or his children, he better say it now. So he had turned to his children and told them simply how much he loved them. And then he had turned to his wife, and she had told him that they would soon meet in eternity, and that everything was going to be all right. And as he stared at her, he remembered that everything began to go dark. And now here he was. He began to feel around with his hand and realized that there was a ceiling up ahead of him and some walls, and that he was enclosed in some small space. For some reason, this thought began to fill him with terror, and he began to bang his fist against the ceiling and against the walls, and his hands became bloody, and even his face became bloody, until finally the pain was so much that he had to stop, and he had to calm himself down. With this ability to recollect, he began to think about where he could possibly be. Then he knew. He didn't know how he knew, he just knew. He was lying in a coffin, and he had been buried alive. He had heard about this sort of thing happening in his town of Old Row. People were being put into the coffin alive, and then the gravedigger coming and unburying them and finding them with their fists all bloody and their faces all scratched up. And he had never really thought that such a thing could occur to him. And yet, here he was, laying in the ground. He tried to think that maybe something else was going on, but he couldn't come up with any other illogical explanation. But as he lay there thinking, he realized that there might be a chance for him. He remembered one of the townsfolk telling him that oftentimes when people were buried alive, they were given a rope which they could pull and wring, and so the gravedigger would come and unbury them. He began to feel around the hole until finally he came across the rope. And he grabbed hold of it and he began to pull it. And he began to ring it and ring it and ring it. And outside, the bell did indeed ring. But as it so happened, there was a storm going on, and the lightning was flashing, and the thunder was rumbling, and the gravedigger himself was sitting on his rocking chair, asleep, with a belly full of soup, so that no one heard him. Finally, he became so frantic that he pulled the rope and it broke in his hand. He could not help but feel angry at the stupidity of whoever was up above as he laid there, and he thought to himself that if they didn't come soon, he was going to run out of oxygen. But the terrible thought as he laid there waiting was that maybe nobody was going to come. And this thought he tried to push away, but in his heart he knew that it was true. So as he lay there, he decided that he needed to do something, and he knew the perfect place to go to, God. He'd always been a churchman, even though he was a man of science. Even for his time, he was considered quite educated, but he'd always believed in God, and he turned to him now, and he put his hands into the form of he put his hands into the form of a prayer, and he asked God to save him from this plight, to bring the gravedigger, to bring someone to help him. But as he laid there, there was no answer from God, and he began to curse God in his mind. And as he lay there, he listened down below, and he thought he could hear screaming, and this thought filled him with a sort of sadness. He couldn't explain it himself, but the sadness crept into him. He knew for a certainty that he was going to die. As he looked around, he realized that there were gray faces surrounding him. Gray faces all crossed, and he could feel them coming closer and closer to him, and his mind was not able to tell any more what was reality and what was fantasy. But he closed his eyes and he opened them again, and he tried to force the faces away, but they kept coming closer and closer to him. And he begged and pleaded for the faces to go away and leave him alone, until finally a thought shot through his head. Pull the rope again, pull the rope again. He didn't understand this thought. The faces had stopped coming towards him, and he looked around and he asked what the thought meant. But the thought occurred to him again, pull the rope, pull the rope. Then he realized what it was meant by it. He reached into the hole and using his 2 fingers tried to grab hold of the rope. It was too far away and he had to struggle and struggle. And he struggled and struggled like this for some time until finally he managed to grab hold of the rope with his 2 fingers and gently pull it. It was a very slight tug, but it did indeed manage to ring the bell. And by another sheer miracle, the gravedigger happened to wake up from this sound. And he got up and he ran out of the shack, and the gravedigger, he began to look around for someone to help him, and finally found a boy sitting on the street eating an apple. And he yelled for the boy, who was quite poor. He was sitting there eating the apple in the rain. He didn't have much money on him. But anyways, the boy came forward, and the gravedigger threw him a shovel and told him it was an emergency and they needed to start digging the grave. So they ran to the grave and they began digging and digging and digging. And the people were all now, at this point, crowding around, seeing what had happened, hearing the commotion and hearing the screaming. And the gravedigger finally came to the coffin, and he pulled it out and he opened it. And when they all stared into it, everyone there was afraid, for the man laying in there, his face was covered in blood and his fists were all numb. And as they looked, they were sure that he was dead, but as the gravedigger looked closer, he realized he was breathing, and he shouted out to the crowd, "He's alive! He's alive!" Well, they grabbed hold of him, and the rain and all this commotion didn't wake him up, but finally, as they dragged him into the shack, he finally managed to open his eyes, and he looked around. And the gravedigger, he brought him some soup, and he brought him a blanket, and the man, he sat there, and he talked to the gravedigger for some time and thanked him for saving him and for the miracle that the gravedigger had managed to find him. And as they sat there, Turner asked him, "My dear friend, would you mind taking me home to my family down at Cinderwind? I would like to see them. It feels as if it has been an eternity." And the gravedigger looked at him, and then he turned to the boy, and Turner, he said, What's the matter?" Finally, the gravedigger turned back to him and he said, "My dear friend, I don't know how to tell you this." Well, tell me," said Turner. "Well, you see, my friend, me and the boy here, we looked at the gravestone and we realized how long you had been trapped in that grave. My friend, you have been in that grave for 25 years now." Well, Turner, he looked at him for a moment, and he seemed to be deep in thought. And then he turned his eyes up towards the ceiling as if he was looking up in the sky. A curious smile formed on his old face. And that is all. Sweet dreams and good night.